Welcome to the tier list seminar. This is very much real, and I did tons and tons of research for this. And by that I mean none. I'm yapping and positing, but do follow along. Now, we're gonna talk about tier lists. And the first thing I think we should start off with is, when do you actually use a tier list? I think we all know what they are. I think we should be focusing on when to use which type of tier list and when to use a tier list at all. Now, you use a tier list to visualize a ranking, a relative ranking, I should say, of many items. And while ranking, said items are hard to distinguish from each other. So as you can see to the right, in this case, you might as well just rank them individually, and a tier list is not needed because there aren't that many items and they are quite easy to distinguish, at least according to the person that made the tier list. You could just say the apple is number 1, the lemon is number 2, banana number 3, and so on, instead of making a tier list. Now, there are many types of tier lists, but we'll be highlighting 3 in particular today. You'll find the purist tier list, liberal tier list, and the categorical tier list on this slide. And I must add that the purist and liberal tier list are on a continuum together. They are both ends of this continuum, starting with categorical tier lists. And as you can see in the lovely example to the right, the tiers are categories in themselves in which items are ranked. And these types of tier lists are either not hierarchical, as you can see in the example, or they are not subjective, as in they are fact checkable. Now, a example of this could be the original Smash Bros. Melee tier list. They are not ranked relative to each other, but they are ranked according to a score. You can see under Sheik 4.9. Now back to this slide, we've still got the purist and the liberal tier lists left. Now, very shortly, the purist tier lists are tier lists that adhere to strict rules. They try to represent reality as closely and as accurately as possible, while liberal tier lists are usually made more for fun. They bend the rules a lot more and they just kind of go with the flow. They go at it. Starting with the purist tier lists, as I said, they adhere to strict rules, and the F, E, D, C, B, A, and S tiers are very commonly used. If tiers are added or tiers are removed, that's usually for a good reason, and if a tier exists, then it should be used by placing an item into it. Ideally, C tier is in the middle of all the tiers, as it is the average tier. A C grade, of course, represents an average grade, and most items end up in this C tier because most items should be around the average. And most items ending up in C tier usually leads to what we call a normal distribution, or a bell curve. And this doesn't happen on purpose, like no purist would move items closer to the center just to make a bell curve, but when representing reality as closely as possible, then a tier list should generally look like a bell curve, either slightly slanted towards a minimum or maximum, or right down the middle. Now, why is this? I've provided an example below to illustrate this. In this experiment, a coin has been tossed 10 times, a bunch of times, and in most of those tossing sprees, the coin showed heads 5 times out of the 10 tosses. The coin landing all heads or all tails is very rare, as opposed to it landing heads about half of the time. And this should happen in a lot more cases where randomness is at play, which is, well, pretty much always. Let's compare this to characters in Smash Bros. We're seeing 2 not ideal tier lists over here, according to purists. To the left is an absolute fucking disaster. No bell curve at all. Mid tier is way down there. Top tier, as they call it, is in fact not at the top. Absolute fucking disgrace of a tier list. And to the right is somewhat better, but S tier is still comprised of 3 tiers, and middle tier is not quite where it should be. Both of these tier lists have been made by Smash Bros, I should add. I think we would agree that even if tier lists by Smash Bros should generally be quite accurate, the most accurate tier list of Smash Ultimate would be one that's comprised of all kinds of different opinions, preferably the opinions of Smash Bros, which is what they did. They made a tier list that comprised the opinions of all Smash Bros. This is what they got. And wouldn't you know it, it's a normal distribution. with generally most characters ending up in the middle. Now, this middle isn't C tier, which isn't ideal, and S tier is still very much inflated for no reason whatsoever. Now, what this example shows you is that the tier list most closely resembling reality is in fact a normal distribution. And now we move back to this slide once more, and we're going off to the other side of the spectrum, the more liberal tier lists. And I don't have to go over this one for as long because these tier lists do not adhere to strict rules. The template is ignored, tiers are renamed, and C tier is very often not in the middle. Something interesting about liberal tier lists is that items are very rarely in a bell curve, but in fact they are more commonly distributed uniformly, meaning that each tier has about as many items as the other tiers. Why this is, I can't really say for sure, but I'd theorize that that would be because 1, we like symmetry, like our brain likes symmetry, and 2, it's just kind of how tier lists have been presented over the years, so we're used to tier lists kind of looking like the example to the right. Now, liberal tier lists are much more simple, much more practical. You can just go off with them, create a tier if you need it, delete one if you don't, and you really do not have to give a shit about resembling reality. But in doing that, they are much less accurate of a true representation of opinion. Because as a purist would argue, there is no way you'd find as many movies a 10 out of 10 as you'd find movies a 9 out of 10 as you'd find movies an 8 out of 10. According to a purist, of course, you'd find way fewer movies a 10 than a 6. Now, to recap, here's when to use what tier list. If your goal is to rank a few easily distinguishable items, then you should not use a tier list at all, you should just rank them. If your goal is to visualize items with a set value or category, it's fact checkable, you're ranking things by height, by nationality, whatever, then you should use a categorical tier list. If your goal is to accurately represent the relative ranking of items, which I would argue would usually be the case when making a tier list of fighting game characters, or if you really feel strongly about ranking movies the right way, then you should be using the more purist tier list. Make sure that C tier is down the middle and be very critical of tier lists that do not show a bell curve. And if you are just visualizing a ranking for fun, use the liberal tier list. Go off, queen. Fuck you.